started, thank you everyone for joining this morning. Just a quick note that this session is being recorded today. I'll introduce our speaker, Joyce, in a moment, but first I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the many lands on which we are meeting today. For myself, that's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. My name is Isabelle. I'm the chair of the Women in Economics Network in Victoria. Women in Economics Network was formed to promote and support the careers of female economists in Australia. The network's activities contribute towards creating more gender balanced and inclusive economics profession that reflects the diversity of wider society. One of the objectives of WEN is to encourage young women to study economics, and it's that that leads us to the research of Joyce Tan. So WEN is delighted to be welcoming Joyce Tan to speak with us today. Joyce is an economist at the Reserve Bank of Australia, and she completed this work that she's going to be sharing with us today while in the public access and education team. Joyce has worked in various roles at the RBA Bank, including in the economic analysis, financial stability and information departments. She completed a Bachelor of Commerce and a Finance Honours degree at the University of Melbourne and is currently studying a Master of Economics degree at the Australian National University. Today, Joyce is going to be talking to us about her recent research into students' proficiency and confidence in studying economics, with a particular emphasis on students' gender and their socio-economic status. Joyce's paper was published in the RBA Bulletin in March 2022, and a copy of the paper is available on the RBA website. I'm now going to hand over to Joyce. There will be an opportunity at the end of the presentation to ask questions using the Q&A function. Leonora Risse is the WEN National Chair, and she'll be keeping an eye on the Q&A, and we encourage you to submit your questions there. You can also upvote and comment if there are any questions that you particularly like. Joyce, I'll hand over to you.
Cool. So hi everyone, thanks Isabelle for the introduction, and thank you to WEN for inviting me to come along this morning. So today I'll be talking about a piece of research that I did at the RBA a few months ago on exploring the confidence gap within economics. But just to start off with a bit of context for how this work came about, as some of you may know, the RBA has a public education program which is committed to supporting economics teachers and economics students, particularly at the high school level. It has the aims of increasing the number of students studying economics, increasing the diversity of the economic student body, as well as boosting the level of economic literacy amongst the general public. We use an evidence-based approach to inform the types of activities that we do as part of the education program. And so that has led to a range of research, and some of this research has already been presented at previous WEN events. Okay, so previous research at the RBA has highlighted the following. First of all, the diversity of high school economics students has been declining over the past few decades on both the gender and socioeconomic fronts. The share of female students has trended down from about 50% of all economics students in the early 90s to about a third in recent years. The share of students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds has also been falling over that same period. And in their research, my colleagues Tanya Livermore and Mike Major sought to understand the reasons contributing to this decline, and to do this by studying what drives students to choose or not choose to study economics. And what they found was that female students and students from schools from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, that they tended to have relatively more negative perceptions of economics as a subject. They were less likely to feel that they could do well in economics, and also less likely to feel that they had a clear understanding of what economics was. And this appeared to be consistent with declines in the shares of enrolments from these groups. These perceptions can have implications for students' choices, particularly when they are making decisions around further study or their future career. And so given this, it's helpful to explore whether differences in self-perceptions between males and females and between students from higher and lower socioeconomic backgrounds, whether these differences reflect differences in their observed ability or something else. In other words, do female students, for example, report having lower confidence in their ability to do economics simply because they don't perform as well in economics as males, or is there some sort of confidence gap? Distinguishing between these factors is important. Having an understanding of why female students or less socially advantaged students perceive their ability to do economics less favourably will help shape how we at the RBA, and I guess the economics community more broadly, should intervene to address this issue. And in doing so, we can hopefully encourage greater participation amongst these students in the subject and therefore help to increase diversity within the discipline. And as you're probably well aware of already, greater diversity has many benefits, particularly given that many with an economics background do go on to working in public policy, or they work in areas where their decisions can have fairly broad impacts. So here is a bit of a roadmap for where we're headed with the rest of the presentation. I'll briefly cover some high-level findings from the literature on these confidence gaps. Then I'll take you through the data set that was used for this piece of analysis. I'll then go through some stylized facts on how different groups of students perceive their understanding of economics versus how they actually perform. I'll then take the information on their observed performance and their self-perceptions together, and I'll talk you through whether there is any evidence of a confidence gap over and above the influence of a student's actual ability. And finally, I also touch on how teachers impact these results before concluding. Okay, so what does the literature tell us? A lot of the studies on confidence gaps have typically been for other disciplines, particularly in STEM, rather than the economics field specifically. They've also tended to focus on gender confidence gaps as opposed to gaps between those from higher and lower socioeconomic backgrounds. A range of studies have found that females do tend to have less favourable perceptions of their ability compared to males in a number of fields. And this is even after you account for measures of their actual ability. These gender differences can appear quite early on and can persist. And confidence gaps are a concern because they may act as a barrier to female students choosing to pursue a study or a career in a particular discipline. So for example, a lot of the studies on STEM enrolments often highlight gender differences in how students perceive their academic abilities as a contributor to the gender gap in STEM college enrolments. Studies on the drivers of confidence gaps have also tended to focus on gender confidence gaps. And so to generalize, these drivers can be broadly split into two buckets, which I call intrinsic and external factors. So intrinsic factors are things you can sort of think of are related to inherent gender differences. So for example, there was a 2011 paper which found that females typically update their beliefs about their abilities more slowly than males upon receiving positive feedback. And so this means, all else equal, females are more likely to have less favourable perceptions about their abilities than males, and this may contribute to a gender confidence gap. External factors are things like societal stereotypes, so the idea that maths is a boys' subject, or that there are particular fields where males are innately better at that field and females are not. And this may be perpetuated by parental beliefs or teacher biases. So for instance, there was a study that found that parents of sons typically attributed their son's success in mathematics to natural talent, but parents of daughters often attributed their daughter's success in mathematics to their daughter working hard or to more effort being exerted. In terms of the literature on confidence gaps between those from more advantaged and less advantaged backgrounds, there isn't a whole heap on this, but where they do exist, they typically do find that those from more socially advantaged backgrounds tend to express having greater levels of confidence. All right, so now let's move on to looking at the data set that was used for this analysis. So I used data from a survey of Year 11 and 12 economic students that the RBA commissioned last year. And in my data set, I have responses for around 2,000 economic students at around 75 schools across Australia. The survey was initially conducted as part of a randomised control trial for the purpose of helping us evaluate the effectiveness of our school talks program. So this is basically where the RBA organises for its economists to deliver presentations to different high schools on monetary policy and current economic conditions. But I only used the pre-treatment results in my analysis. And essentially, we saw the opportunity to leverage the fact that the survey data contained both responses on how students perceive their understanding of economics and their confidence in the subject. And it also contained information that allowed us to gauge their actual understanding of economics, or at least proxy for this. And so this meant that we could use it to explore whether differences in how students assess their understanding of economics, whether that was consistent with differences in their actual abilities, or whether something else could be said about those differences. I then combined the student level data from the survey with school level data from the Australian Curriculum Assessment and Reporting Authority, as well as data that I collected on the teacher's sex or inferred sex. So together, the information that I had on hand could be broadly categorized into 3 categories. So first of all, student level, school level, and teacher characteristics. So this includes things like the student's self-reported gender, their year level, whether they were in year 11 or 12, the school type, including whether it was a single sex or a co-ed school, the school's socio-economic background, and as mentioned earlier, the teacher's inferred sex. The second lot of variables tried to capture self-perceptions of a student. So there were a couple of questions in the survey that asked students to rate themselves on several dimensions on a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 being the lowest rating and 5 being the highest. But for this particular piece of research, the questions that were most relevant were the ones that asked students to rate their understanding of economics. So specifically their understanding of monetary policy or their understanding of current economic conditions, as well as the question that asked them to rate their confidence in their ability to understand and complete the economic subject. Finally, the last group of variables were trying to capture the students' actual performance. So there were a number of knowledge-based questions on the survey, and based on their performance on these questions, I was essentially able to construct a score for each student. This basically tried to proxy their economics ability at the time of the survey. It doesn't say anything about their potential or their ability more generally. And these questions, these knowledge-based questions, were all multiple choice. They covered a range of topics, including the transmission of monetary policy, inflation, and unemployment. So typical questions might be, if the RBA changed the cash rate in this direction, what impact does it have on the unemployment rate? Or it might be, your wages go up by X%, but inflation is Y%. Are you better off, worse off, or about the same? But as with any other data set, there are a few caveats to bear in mind, although we do think the data still lends itself to being analysed and still offers interesting insights. And these caveats largely just reflect the fact that the survey was initially designed to assess or evaluate the school talks program. So first of all, it has meant that the schools participating in the survey are a subset of schools that offer economics and that also attended an RBA school talk. And as a result of this, the surveyed schools are slightly more likely to be schools from higher socioeconomic backgrounds compared to schools that offer economics more generally. Secondly, you may have noted that the knowledge-based questions tended to have a more macroeconomics flavour to them. And this is simply because the school talks are typically focused on RBA style topics, as you might expect. So whilst having questions that also cover more microeconomic topics would have provided a more comprehensive measure of economics, of their understanding of economics, I think it's still reasonable to use the questions in the survey as a proxy for their actual economics proficiency. All right, so now let's look at a few stylized facts, in particular relating to students' self-perceptions and how they actually performed. So I'll start off by talking you through the differences between females and males using some simple correlations. So let me walk you through this graph. Focusing on the top panel, this graph shows you the share of females and males split up by how they rated their understanding of monetary policy. The red components of these bars indicate the share of females and males that rated their understanding a 1 or the lowest rating, while the blue components of the bars reflect the share that rated their understanding a 5 or the highest rating. And the bottom panel does the exact same thing, except that it reflects their ratings of their confidence in their ability to understand and complete their economic subject. So from this graph, you can see that female students are more likely to report having a poorer understanding of economics and less confidence in their ability to do economics compared to males. So in the top panel, looking at the red and pink bars, you can see that around a third of female students rated their understanding a 1 or a 2, whilst for males, the share was about 20%. Likewise, if you look at the green and blue bars, you can see that around a quarter of female students rated their understanding a 4 or a 5, compared to almost half of all male students. Turning to the bottom panel now, which looks at their confidence in their ability to do economics, a similar story holds. Females are less likely to report having high levels of confidence, and you can see that by the fact that the green and blue bars are smaller for females compared to males. Now, it could also be interesting to split students up, not just on the male-female split, but also by whether or not they attended a co-ed or a single-sex school. And when we do this, we see that the gender differences remain, irrespective of whether the student attends a co-ed school or a single-sex school. Females continue to be more likely to report having a poorer understanding than males. So comparing the sum of the red and pink bars in the left-hand side panel, you can see that females at co-ed schools are around twice as likely to rate their understanding a 1 or a 2 compared to males at co-ed schools. And on the right-hand side panel, you can see that females are also more likely to rate their understanding a 1 or a 2 compared to males at single-sex schools, although the gender difference looks relatively smaller at single-sex schools than at co-ed schools. And similar patterns hold even when you look at some of the other self-perception questions, such as on, say, the confidence in their ability to do economics. But I haven't shown it here for brevity. We've taken a look at how students perceive their understanding of economics, but now let's consider a measure of how they actually perform on those knowledge-based questions. So this graph here shows you the distribution of scores for both females and males at co-ed schools in the left-hand side panel and at single-sex schools on the right. And overall, without controlling for any other characteristics, female students in our sample appear to perform worse than males. In the left-hand side panel, comparing the darker green components of the bars, around a quarter of females at co-ed schools achieve a score above 75%, compared to over a third of males. Females at co-ed schools are also more likely to achieve very low scores below 25%, which is shown in the dark orange, compared to males at co-ed schools. Now, if you look at the right-hand side panel, a similar pattern is observed. Females are also less likely to achieve very high scores above 75%, although the share receiving a low score below 25% in the dark orange appears to be relatively similar for females and males at single-sex schools. So the takeaways from these graphs so far is that without controlling for any other factors, it appears that females report more negative perceptions of their understanding and confidence, and also appear to perform worse than males in the sample. All right, so now let's look at differences in self-perceptions and actual performance by socioeconomic status. And in general, what we find is that students who consider themselves to have a good understanding of economics, that they generally come from schools from higher socioeconomic backgrounds. So there's a fair bit happening in this graph, so let me just unpack it bit by bit. This graph here shows you the socioeconomic distribution of students based on how they rated their understanding of monetary policy. On the horizontal axis, we have the ICSEA score, which provides a measure of the school's socioeconomic background. It stands for the Index of Community Socio-Educational Advantage, and it's computed for each school, taking into account things like the geographical location of the school, the parents' occupation, and the parents' educational levels. A higher ICSEA score indicates a more socially advantaged school, and so you can sort of think of the school's ICSEA score as being a proxy for the student's own individual socioeconomic background, although of course in practice there will be instances where that's not necessarily the case. Each coloured line there corresponds to a different rating. So for example, blue corresponds to the highest rating of 5 and pink corresponds to the lowest rating of 1. Lines that are shifted lower indicate that students choosing that particular rating are less likely to come from schools from lower socioeconomic backgrounds and more likely to come from schools from higher socioeconomic backgrounds. So looking at the intersection of that vertical line with those colored lines, you can see that of students that rated their understanding a 5, around 75% attend a school with an ICSEA score below 1200, or in other words, 25% attend a school with an ICSEA score above 1200. On the other hand, for students who consider themselves to have quite a poor understanding of economics, so those who rated themselves a 1 in the pink, only 4% attended a school with an ICSEA score above 1200. So taking this together, this suggests that students with a higher self-perceived understanding, or those who rated themselves more highly, they are more likely to come from a more socially advantaged school, as measured by the ICSEA score. Similar to before, we can also look at this breakdown, but by the actual performance of students based on those knowledge-based questions. And what we can see is that students who tended to perform better were more likely to come from a more socially advantaged school. Although I should note here that that isn't to say that students at more advantaged schools are inherently smarter. It could simply reflect the school's access to resources. In this graph, the darker green corresponds to a student receiving a score above 75%, whilst the dark orange corresponds to a score below 25%. And once again, looking at that vertical line, we can see that around a quarter of students who achieved a score above 75% attend a school with an ICSEA score above 1200, compared to about 5% of students that scored below 25% in the dark orange. So far, it seems that females and students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds both have more negative perceptions of their understanding and confidence, but they also tend to perform worse compared to males and those from higher socioeconomic backgrounds when we don't control for any other factors. But in order to see if there is any evidence that points to the existence of a confidence gap, we need to do a little bit more work. And in particular, we need to control for a measure of the student's actual ability or their actual performance on those knowledge-based questions. So to do this, I investigate how self-perceptions can vary with being a female student or a student from a lower socioeconomic background before and after accounting for their actual economics understanding or their actual performance. I use an ordinal logistic regression and regress either the student's self-assessed understanding or the self-assessed confidence, which I showed you on the graph earlier, on their actual performance, again shown in the earlier graphs, an indicator of whether they were female, their ICSIA score, and a couple of controls for other student and school level characteristics, including their year level, whether the school was a single sex or a co-ed school, and so on. And using this model, we can identify the effect of being female on the probability that a particular rating is chosen. So this graph is probably the key graph of the article. Here in this graph, the rating in question is a student's self-reported understanding of monetary policy, which is shown on the horizontal axis, although similar results are also obtained from using some of the other self-perception questions. The purple bars here show you the effect of being female on the probability that a particular rating is selected in a model where we don't account for the student's current proficiency or the current performance on the questions in the survey. And in the blue bars, we have the effect of being female on the probability that a particular rating is chosen in a model where we do account for a measure of their current ability. So looking at the purple bars, consistent with the results from the earlier graphs, females are statistically significantly more likely than males to report having a poorer understanding of monetary policy in a model where we don't account for their observed proficiency or their actual performance. And you can see this because the purple bars are positive for the lower ratings, which means that females are more likely than males to choose those lower ratings, and by the fact that the purple bars are negative at the higher ratings, which implies that females are less likely than males to choose those higher ratings. So for example, females are around 9 percentage points more likely to give themselves a rating of 1 compared to males, and around over 5 percentage points more likely to, or less likely to choose a rating of 5 compared to males on average. But perhaps what's more interesting about this graph is the fact that the gap between females and males remains even after you account for a measure of their actual ability or their actual performance. And you can see this in the graph in the blue bars because the blue bars follow the same shape as the purple. Females are still more likely than males to choose a lower rating and less likely to choose a higher rating. This gap remains statistically significant. It has narrowed somewhat relative to the model where we don't account for the actual performance, so the purple bars, but yes, remains statistically significant. The blue bars now suggest that on average, female students are around 7.5 percentage points more likely to choose a rating of 1, and around 4.5 percentage points less likely to choose a rating of 5. And so this is evidence that a confidence gap exists even after you account for the student's actual ability. On the other hand, when we look at it by socioeconomic status, the results are a bit different. In a model that doesn't account for a student's actual performance, it is true that students with a higher socioeconomic background, that they tend to be more likely to report having a better understanding of economics or greater confidence. And this is consistent with the correlations that I showed you in the earlier line graphs. However, once you control for a measure of their actual proficiency, that relationship is no longer evident. So what does this mean? It implies that the tendency for more socially advantaged students to have more favourable perceptions of their understanding and greater confidence, that is in line with their tendency to perform better in the survey. And so this suggests that there doesn't appear to be a confidence gap between students from higher and lower socioeconomic backgrounds. But I would like to emphasize here that it's not saying that students at schools from higher socioeconomic backgrounds are naturally more talented, because there are other factors that could be at play. Okay, so now let's talk about teachers. One potential way to address gender confidence gaps is to look into the impact of having a greater number of female role models. And studies in other disciplines, such as STEM, have suggested that it can have a positive impact on the self-perceptions of female students. And one way that a female role model can appear is in the form of a teacher. So given this, I also explore how a teacher's sex could impact the self-reported understanding and confidence levels of students in the sample. So this graph here shows you how much more likely, on average, female students are in choosing a particular rating relative to male students when their teacher is female in the purple bars and when their teacher is male in the green. And the key takeaway from this graph is that having a female teacher appears to have a more positive impact on the self-perceptions of a female student. So looking at the first two bars on the far left, you can see that when a teacher is male in green, females are around 9 percentage points more likely than male students to rate their understanding A1. But when the teacher is female, this decreases to 5 percentage points. Alternatively, you can look at the two bars on the far right, which says that on average, when the teacher is male, females are almost 6 percentage points less likely to choose a rating of 5 compared to male students. But this narrows when the teacher is female, in which case they're only 3 percentage points less likely to choose a rating of 5. But nevertheless, the confidence gap still remains. Even with a female teacher, females are still more likely to choose a lower rating and less likely to choose a higher rating. And this is illustrated on the graph by the fact that the purple bars are positive at the lower end of the scale and negative at the higher end. So this implies that whilst it does help to have a female teacher, it doesn't quite eliminate the confidence gap. And it is also the case that the gender of the teacher doesn't have a significant impact on male students, consistent with other studies. So what does this all mean in practice? Well, it suggests that increasing the presence of female role models even further will likely be beneficial. And this can come in a range of forms. So for us at the RBA, in the context of our public education program, it suggests that we could consider trying to further boost female representation amongst the presenters of our School Talks program, as well as those advocating for economics at events like careers fairs. But more generally, it could mean trying to increase the number of female teachers in economics and further increase the visibility of female economists in the public domain. For students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, given the finding that their lower self-assessed understanding or lower confidence appears to be consistent with their tendency to not perform as well in the survey, it suggests that we should be trying to find ways to boost their actual understanding of economics content. So here at the RBA, this could involve us trying to further raise awareness of our School Talks program and our online student resources, particularly at those less advantaged schools. But just to summarise, the main findings from this piece of research are that female students and students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, both of them tend to express more negative views of their understanding of economics and less confidence in their ability to do the subject relative to other students. Gender differences in these perceptions persist even after you account for a student's actual economics proficiency or the actual performance, and this points to a confidence gap. Since this can influence the choices that female students make when they're considering further study or a career in economics, it's worthwhile to consider potential interventions to address this, of which one is increasing the presence of female role models in economics. On the other hand, differences in self-perceptions by socioeconomic status are in line with differences in their actual performance. And so this suggests that strategies to improve the understanding of students at less socially advantaged schools could be helpful. But that's all that I was going to present on this morning. I might hand it back to Isabelle or Leonora to facilitate the questions.
Thank you so much, Joyce. Some really interesting findings for both females and students with lower socioeconomic status, and I think really just highlights the importance of sort of disaggregating that data further to understand the impacts on different groups rather than looking at everything at an aggregate level. We will jump straight into questions, and just a reminder that if you do have any questions, please send them through using the Q&A chat, which Leonora will be monitoring and we'll turn to in a moment. First of all, Joyce, you've shown us that the confidence gap exists for female students and not males and why this matters, and touched on the importance of role models. Could you talk a little bit more about interventions that may be likely to, or have even proven to, reduce this confidence gap, and the role of organisations such as the RBA, such as Women Economics Network, to assist in these interventions?
Yeah, sure. So in terms of the studies that I've come across that sort of touch on how to narrow these gender confidence gaps, they've almost always referred to increasing the number of female role models. It's definitely been the strategy that has been studied the most. And I think in practice it can come in a lot of forms. So obviously, boosting the number of publicly visible female economists is a great starting point, but it could also involve considering opportunities where female economic students or potential students are able to be mentored by female economists, or organising for networking opportunities to allow for that more direct interaction and direct communication. We could also consider collaborations with economics teachers associations to see how we can support them and get their views on how we can best add value. I mean, obviously they have much closer contact to students and are probably much more in tune with what works best. So whether that's more so formal arrangements like opportunities to shadow an economist, or delivering school talks to students. I mean, I know the RBA does do school talks, but we cover a part of the syllabus. We don't cover some of the more microeconomic topics, in which case, like, some people on the line might be better placed to talk about those topics.
Fantastic, thank you so much, and makes complete sense when you say it like that. And really aligns with some of the things that WEN has been trying to do, so really encouraging to see that. At the same time, there are some interventions that we may have considered in the past to increase diversity in the economics profession, increase the number of women interested in studying economics, which perhaps we need to rethink. So, for example, like, it might be tempting to hear a result like, oh, women are less confident than men, and think, oh, okay, we need to fix the women. Like, the women have a confidence problem. What can we do to fix them? And it's kind of that lean in narrative of women need to be more like men, instead of considering what we need to fix with the culture or the system or the environment. Are there any interventions or strategies like that that we've used in the past that you think may be less likely to work from what you've found?
I mean, like, I definitely hope this piece isn't interpreted in the way that, if you fix the women, then, the problem's resolved and that's that. Or that, if you give all female economic students, a confidence boost, that, the schoo within the discipline will just, the schoo towards males in the discipline will just go away. This piece mainly tries to convey that, there are differences in how males and females perceive their own abilities, which doesn't seem to be accounted for by their actual abilities, and that there is something else that can contribute to that there is something else contributing to the gap there, and that can contribute to reductions in the number of females entering the field. And that something else can reflect, a lot of those environmental factors, the values and beliefs that you're instilled with as you grow up. I wouldn't say that there is a particular intervention that jumps to mind as being very clearly wrong, but I do think that there is scope to, further expand out what we can do, and tying that back to the role models element, or the potential ways that we could, implement that that was talked about a bit earlier.
Fantastic. Going on to the socioeconomic findings now, where, as you mentioned, they're also more likely to be less confident, but then actually reflected in their understanding or proficiency as well, in the survey. This is, as you said, quite a different problem to what we're seeing in the females. Are there interventions that, again, we should be considering for these groups, or perhaps, again, not considering for them? So, for example, the way we target interacting with students, whether it be through programs that the RBA or WEN does.
Yeah, I mean, like in the literature, I haven't come across the whole heap that sort of cover, exactly how you close that gap between between people from higher and lower socioeconomic backgrounds. In terms of the work that I can think of, it would be a colleague of mine, Peter Ricard's work on evaluating the school talks program. So he was able to show that that had positive impacts on students' understanding, like the actual performance, as well as their self-perceived understanding. So things like school talks and trying to impart and explain different concepts and different economic concepts to students through a presentation that is very digestible. That could work. I mean, going back to the earlier point, we cover like monetary policy and RBA topics like inflation there, but there is a whole range of other concepts in the economics syllabus that we don't touch on, but where other people could provide their stance on it. So that's probably an area where people can get involved.
Filling that gap in the microeconomics kind of area.
Yeah.
Finally, based on the results of your research, what do you think the next research question that we should analyse in relation to diversity in economics would be? Like, is there a particular intervention that you think should be analysed further, or are there other survey questions that you'd like to ask students that can sort of help us unpack these issues even further?
Yeah, so I mean, something that I'm kind of personally interested in is looking into the transition between the years 9 and 10 level and the years 11 and 12 levels, and how that affects economics enrollment. So from some other work that I've done with a few other colleagues, we were looking at the landscape of year 11 and 12 economics students. And there's already quite a clear skew towards males in that cohort. And so it's almost as though if you want to consider interventions to address any gender imbalances in the field, that you almost want to introduce those interventions even earlier before they even reach that stage. And so I know that in years 9 and 10 that some students do like a commerce subject, and that's their first exposure to economics as a subject. And I believe that at that level, the gender balance is looking much better. So I'll be interested in sort of trying to understand, why do females drop off after the years 9 and 10 levels? Is it related to them doing this commerce subject, or does doing this commerce subject mean that they are more likely to stay in economics and are more likely to retain these students? Which case, potentially like early exposure to economics might be a good intervention. And just understand how that transition happens between that years 9 and 10 stage to years 11 and 12, and whether there are any drivers behind that drop off.
That makes so much sense. And even like in my head, like often we engage with university students and thinking, that might be too late. Even years 11 and 12 might be too late. We have to go even further is really, something for us to consider when we're thinking about how to engage students.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much, Joyce. Leonora, I might throw over to you. It looks like we've got some questions in the chat.
Thank you, Isabelle, and thank you, Joyce, for a fantastic presentation and a really valuable piece of research and contribution to the field. We have some great questions coming in. I'll do my best to get through them all. So the first question from Marla is a point of clarification. Does the survey cover all states? Do you control for states? And I guess that might throw up some questions about, are there differences in state curriculums that might need to be factored in here?
Yeah, so the schools that were surveyed came from all states. And yes, there are controls in there for each state. The only thing I'd say that there is that because like within each state there aren't that many schools, that I wouldn't read too much into those state specific controls.
Okay, thank you. The next question from Amy asked about, does this have implications for workplace and retaining female staff in the economics roles? And I guess that's asking, are these findings or are these dynamics transferable into the workplace? Do we expect these types of issues to also happen in the workplace? And I'd like to bundle that together with another comment that's come through from Therese Jefferson, who has also brought up the issue about the risk of overconfidence. So we're talking about a confidence gap, and I guess it implies that ideally women would have higher confidence, but I guess, is there a problem or a concern that perhaps the males have too much confidence that doesn't perhaps align with their proficiency? So if I could bundle that together to think about the role of confidence, not just amongst economic students, but what do your findings tell you about the workplace and what happens when these economic students enter the professional context?
Yeah, so I think maybe if I target the second question first on overconfidence. Generally in the studies, they imply, female underconfidence, but I have come across like 1 or 2 papers that have mentioned that at the same time that females appear relatively underconfident relative to their actual abilities, it is also the case that males are relatively overconfident relative to their abilities, if that makes sense. And then in terms of whether this has implications for the workplace, potentially. I mean, I am looking at economics students specifically at the high school level, but I wouldn't be surprised if you see some of these issues continue on beyond the high school level. A lot of the literature has sort of talked about how even at like university, that you can see these gaps appearing in other disciplines like STEM. There was also one paper, like one of the few papers that I did encounter, which was on economics, where they found that female academics in the economics fields at like very highly distinguished universities, that even after you account for things like the tenure, the academic publications, that they were still observed to have relatively lower confidence relative to males at the same universities. So, I mean, that's some evidence that at least that it is appearing in the workplace and that the gap is persistent.
And the environment itself makes it legitimate for men to assert their confidence, but it makes it more challenging for women, even if they're highly capable, to express confidence as well. So I think those, when you discuss the cultural and the environmental factors, that's applicable both at schools and in the wider workplace as well.
Yeah.
There's so many great questions here. Tina has asked, and there's so many wonderful positive comments and feedback for you to read there, Joyce, as well. Tina has asked, given the importance of role models, is there evidence on which sort of role models are most effective? What can women working in the profession now do to help? And if I may, can I please mention that WEN has an initiative here where women in the profession can help. We have our Register of Economists, which we invite all WEN members to add your profile to, indicating not just your expertise of research, but also your availability to go and speak to school students. We've added that as a category. So if there are any WEN members who are interested in adding your names to that register of professional economists who'd like to go out and speak to students, we have that facility there for you. But Joyce, is there anything further that you'd like to discuss here in terms of what types of role models are most effective?
Yeah, I haven't seen any studies that sort of like, weight up each form of role model and to see which one has been the most effective. But I think just, chipping away at all sorts of channels, collectively will help, rather than just focusing on one single channel. So, for example, in the engineering field, what they found was they tried to leverage social media with a hashtag that was like, I look like an engineer, and it was simply, female engineers taking photos of themselves in their natural work environment to sort of normalize, female engineers, and so that was something that went viral. And so you can see that, like, it can be through a lot of different sorts of channels where where it can have an effect on students and future economists.
That's a good point, because we have such diversity of students, it probably will require a diversity of approaches to reach all those students as well. I see that the issue of low socioeconomic backgrounds is coming through as a key concern amongst our questions. Inga has made the observation that there's some concern that economics is encouraged or promoted as a serious subject within higher socioeconomic schools. And Jessica has asked about what type of interventions exist for students coming from low socioeconomic backgrounds which do not offer economics, and economics is not talked about at home. Many students don't even know what economics is in those types of settings. Is that something that perhaps the bank is addressing, or something where you see you've detected some evidence in your research and your survey of the existing studies that there are some indications of what approaches work to reach students from low socioeconomic backgrounds?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say specifically in this particular piece of research. We through other work, we have sort of looked at that landscape of economic students and sort of have seen that, economics as a discipline at the years 11 and 12 levels is skewed towards those higher socioeconomic backgrounds. And I guess, like, in terms of ways to address this, there are a number of things that you sort of also need to account for. So things like when we deliver our school talks, for example, one benefit from COVID was that it became all online, and so that allowed us to reach a greater number of schools. But potentially for some of those, very disadvantaged schools, that might be another hurdle. So I wouldn't say that I've got a good answer for exactly what we should be doing, but there are some other considerations that you need to think of when we are trying to think of ways to address this.
That's right. And I think adding to that is how we teach economics, the topics that we cover. Do we incorporate into our economics teaching issues such as inequality and disadvantage that in general would have presumably more, perhaps more meaning and resonate more with those students, and they probably are far more attuned as to what the answers are for some of those big economic challenges as well. So I think it's also the scope there for economics itself to evolve and to expand the topics and the issues that we're presenting to students as well, which I think good schools are doing and good teachers are doing. There's a question here from Samar. Thank you for your question, that makes the observation that there was more gender parity in the past than now. And I know when we've looked at some of the student numbers, especially during the 1990s in high schools in economics, it was closer to parity. In some cases, there are actually more female students than male students. So something has changed over time. And I know some of the other RBA research has followed that over time as well. This question from Samath it suggests that this confidence gap is a more recent phenomenon. Why is it more salient now than in the past? That's a challenging question. Is there something that's changing in our current circumstances, Joyce, that you think might explain why we're noticing it now, we're paying attention to it now?
I mean, it has been a general trend down in terms of the female share within economics, and that's something that, as you mentioned, that previous work by Tanya and Mike have been trying to try to get to the bottom of that, and some of the reasons that have sort of been put forward from their study of years 10 to 12 students about why did they not choose to study economics, is that it has a bit of an image problem in the sense that students, particularly females and those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, don't appear to have expressed as much interest in the subject, and that they also don't really have a good understanding, or they don't feel like they have a clear understanding of what it is. They feel like it is more of a risk to study because of that. So I think these factors could be contributing to that general trend downwards for females.
Yes, probably a combination of factors. I think also the differences between the co-ed and the single schools, that really stood out. And so I guess it suggests that if you are in an environment where the majority of other students and people around you are female, you're not in the minority. And so by virtue of being in a minority, I guess if those numbers have been shrinking over time, that makes sense that women might start to doubt their ability, and it sort of gives them more reason for their confidence to wane, because they feel like they're in the minority now. So I guess those factors do intersect. I think we've come to the end of the webinar now, so I just would like to reiterate how grateful we are, Joyce, for you for sharing your research today, and thank you to all of the participants for tuning in and sharing your questions. Over to you, Isabelle.
Thank you, Leonora, and thank you so much, Joyce. And I think that last question really just shows the value of continuing to do research such as this over time, so we can look back at 2022 and go, what was the confidence gap now versus say 10 years, and keep tracking how we're going. Thank you everyone so much for attending. If you are interested in elevating the visibility of women working in economics, or are interested in learning more about WEN in general, I encourage you to visit our website. Leonora mentioned some of our initiatives earlier, and you can also sign up to be a member of WEN. I'd also like to encourage you to head over to the RBA website where you can view Joyce Tent's paper in full, alongside a lot of the other results from the RBA that we have talked about today, which are providing us with those really valuable insights into economics students. Finally, just huge thanks to Joyce. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Hope you have a wonderful Friday.